The U.S. government just admitted to recovering materials from UFOs. Decades ago, visitors from other planets warned us about where we were headed and offered to help, but instead we, or at least some of us, interpreted their visits as a threat and decided to shoot first, ask questions later. The quote comes from former Canadian Defense Minister Paul Hellyer, and he has been talking about this for decades now. He's disclosing extraterrestrials and UFOs from other planets. First off, the fact that the official disclosure of unidentified flying objects has happened is huge, and those who are avid researchers of the phenomenon saw this one coming. For years, we've experienced, as many have said many times before, an official campaign of ridicule and secrecy. Ex-CIA Director Roscoe Hellencotter says of the phenomenon, the establishment in many ways was responsible for the foolish articles that would constantly appear in mainstream media publications, absolutely ridiculing the topic that was and is actually quite real. And today we've seen a complete 180-degree turn, a switch. UFOs are no longer ridiculed by mainstream, which should raise a serious serious eyebrows, because very seldom does mainstream media share any sort of truth, especially when we're talking about projects that rank among the most secretive in the world, such as black budget programs. Unfortunately, most of our media is controlled by a small group of people, and declassified documents alongside whistleblower testimony has made this very clear. Intelligence agencies have close relationship with every major wire service, newspaper, news weekly, and television network in the nation, and has helped us turn some intelligent failure stories into intelligent success stories, and has contributed to the accuracy of countless others. And this comes straight from a CIA document. Dr. Udo Ulfkotte, Cheryl Atkinson, Amber Leon, and many others have also provided many examples of what it's like to work inside a media organization that's dominated by government, corporate, deep state interests. And this is exactly why mainstream UFO disclosure is questionable, and there appears to be multiple things happening here. One is the fact that the phenomenon was obvious for anybody who looked into it from a research perspective. There was and has been more than ample evidence to show that the UFOs were and are real, that there are objects in our atmosphere which are technically miles in advance of anything we can deploy. Lord Admiral Hill Norton, former chairman of NATO Military Committee, said. The statement from Victor Marchetti, former special assistant to the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, does not seem to hold so true anymore, at least the last part. He said, quote, we have indeed been contacted, perhaps even visited, by extraterrestrial beings, and the U.S. government, in collusion with the other national powers of the earth, is determined to keep this information from the general public. This is May 1979, Second Look, Volume 1, Number 7, Washington, D.C. One of the biggest mouthpieces for this establishment, the New York Times admitted something that the establishment, or facets of it, have been concealing for years, that UFOs are real. The Times broke the story about a secret Pentagon program, but any UFO researcher knows these programs are more in-depth, expansive than anything that's described here. According to the Times, quote, in the $600 billion annual Defense Department budgets, the $22 million spent on the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program was almost impossible to find, which is how the Pentagon wanted it. For years, the program investigated reports of unidentified flying objects, according to Defense Department officials, interviews of program participants, and records obtained by New York Times. It was run by a military intelligence official, Luis Elizondo, on the fifth floor of the Pentagon C-Ring, deep within the building's maze. The Defense Department has never before acknowledged the existence of the program, which it says it shut down in 2012. But its backers say that while the Pentagon ended funding for the effort at the time, the program remains in existence. And for the past 5 years, they said officials with the program have continued to investigate episodes brought to them by service members while also carrying out their other Defense Department duties. But what's missing from mainstream UFO disclosure? One interesting thing to note here is the sharing of information and truth in order to lie. For example, MK Ultra program, CIA-based mind control, is a great example because the evidence became so obvious that the US government had no choice but to disclose the reality of it. And although they clearly did not share all the public thought they did, the program had been declassified, and thus all of the questions and inquiries into the program stopped because apparently the government released everything there is to know. This is what we could be seeing with the UFO program. Prior to this disclosure, dozens of other governments had already done so themselves, and the field is loaded with a ton of credible witness testimonies, as well as various documents released via the Freedom of Information Act. And we know that this spring, the UK is going to declassify all their UFO ET files to be made public for the whole world to examine and read. So that's going to be a big cache of documents coming out soon. Now, going back to this, now that the Pentagon has admitted to this program, does this mean the existence of UFOs has been disclosed and that's all there is to it? Are we seeing a clever way of releasing information in order to conceal more important information? Or is this really a slow disclosure initiative by the US government? And if it is, why are they doing this? Quote, why is the mainstream covering this story the way they are? I've been saying for years that the mainstream media, the establishment media, will never cover the UFO subject in a serious way. That is, until they would be absolutely pushed to the wall and then do something. So the question is, what's going on here? If they're the voice of the establishment media, mainstream media, then why have the establishment elected to put this story out? The question above comes from historian Richard Dolan. He's one of the most prominent thinkers of our time. He's also one of the world leading researchers on the topics of UFOs. Richard goes on to explain in the lecture that this is simply a tidbit of truth that's been made to look like the complete truth. It brings up a number of key things that have been ignored by mainstream media regarding the recent UFO disclosure, which is being addressed through To the Stars Academy. Dolan said the best way to keep the secret is you pretend to share it, you give some information out, some genuine information, which they did. There were some significant revelations here, significant omissions, and much that was not followed up. And he outlines what's missing here. This is such an important point that there has been no follow-up regarding the alleged possession of the materials that have been recovered from this object. Quote, yes, there have been crashed craft and bodies recovered. We are not alone in the universe. They have been coming here for a long time. I happen to be privileged enough to be on the fact that we have been visited on this planet and the UFO phenomenon is real, end quote. Apollo 14 astronaut Dr. Edgar Mitchell said. The head of this program was Luis Elizondo, a career intelligence officer. His experience includes working with the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, and National Counterintelligence Executive. He also spent time as a Director of National Intelligence. And furthermore, he's managed the security for several sensitive projects for the U.S. government as the Director for the National Program Special Management Staff. For the last 10 years of his career, Elizondo, quote, ran a sensitive aerospace threat identification program focusing on unidentified aerial technologies, end quote, where he learned that the phenomenon is indeed real. He is big on the fact that there is enough evidence to suggest that we're not alone, and he's also mentioned that materials from these objects have indeed been collected and studied, so this is huge. This was mentioned in the New York Times article that materials have been indeed recovered from the craft, but Elizondo gave an exclusive interview to the organizers of the UFO Congress, the world's biggest UFO Congress. It took place in Phoenix, Arizona, which painted a different story. Alejandro Rojas, host of the UFO Congress, said Mr. Elizondo had told him more about the metal during the exclusive interviews that were screened at that event. And Mr. Rojas says, "I can tell you it is not an alloy like the New York Times claims." One of the authors of the Times report, Ralph Blumenthal, had this to say on MSNBC about those alloys. Quote, "They have, as we reported in the paper, some material from these objects that is being studied so that scientists can find what accounts for their amazing properties, this technology of these objects, whatever they are." End quote. And when asked what the materials were, Blumenthal responded, quote, "They don't know. They're studying it, but it's some kind of compound that they don't recognize," end quote. According to Rojas, quote, "I shared at our conference that Elizondo has told me it is a metamaterial with strange isotopic values indicating it is not from Earth," end quote. This is quite significant. We've been given the narrative that it's not really known where these objects are, and figures like Neil deGrasse Tyson went on national television trying to ridicule the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Quote, "I am not aware of any effort within the established media to follow up on these pieces of the UFOs and to find out where this comes from. I mean, nothing. So it's 5 months later and we're clearly not dealing with a serious effort by the mainstream media for that reason alone. I have had information now from a very good source that what they've recovered are not metal alloys, that they're being described as metamaterials, a very different thing. The individual that I spoke with about where did that phrase metal alloy come, did it come because Luis Elizondo, as I was told, no, it did not come from him," end quote, Richard Dolan stated. Now, the New York Times article also mentions that these materials were shipped off to Bigelow Aerospace for examination, which is interesting because in a recent interview with 60 Minutes, Robert Bigelow, founder of Bigelow Aerospace Corporation, stated that he is aware of an intelligent extraterrestrial presence visiting the Earth. This means that it came from one of the authors of New York Times article, an editor or an intelligence agency. And Dolan refers to this aspect of the article as intentionally deceptive, quote unquote. Another interesting thing is that Elizondo had mentioned multiple times that these encounters have occurred hundreds of times, and there have been extremely phenomenal encounters that never really seemed to grab the attention of his higher-ups, which is also odd. A lot of these encounters have been documented well before this disclosure, and there's a lot to discuss about this topic and what's going on here. The talk is interesting to say the least, and if you've made it this far, I recommend you give the whole thing a listen. Now, the topic is very significant, especially from a consciousness perspective. It leaves no aspect of humanity untouched, and we just completed a very interesting podcast with Richard Lawrence, Secretary of the Etheria Society in Europe, discussing these implications, and you could listen to the podcast, to the interview in the video link below. This is by Alexander Light on Humans Are Free. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.